Hello. So I wanted to use this video to give you a quick rundown on some of the mechanics of Power Outage 1.4. And the best place to start off is with the four main attributes. So to get into it, each character, whether they be a hero or a villain, has four major attributes to them. Those attributes are impact, power, omer, and yield points. So I'll get into each one of these attributes and give you an idea of what they are. And I'm kind of whatever you want to call it. I'm kind of freestyling this, so there's going to be a few ums and ahs, and I apologize for that from now. But this is just kind of running through each of the attributes that you'll see that you'll build into each character. And to start off, there is impact. So a character will have these four attributes, and the first one is impact. And what impact does is it affects all the human characteristics of a superhero. That means, first off, if you're in combat, it would affect your ability to land a punch or a kick, or basically any kind of generic attack. So with Power Outage, there's no real specification about who or what a character is. So they could be a ghost or a robot or whatever the case may be. But Impact would describe the generic version of whatever their attack is. And for the sake of kids and for the sake of an introduction, the quickest way to call it is a punch or a kick. But it could be whatever you want it to be. So within a combat, your impact would be your ability to land a punch or kick. Impact has some other built-in characteristics to it, because impact also describes a person's social presence when they are, what their social impact is on others. So that'll affect their ability to persuade people, potentially intimidate a villain, or encourage people to go along with what they want. So it affects their social abilities with other NPCs or characters that the GM would typically play. Impact also affects most of the physicality of a character, their ability to use their strength or use their ability to jump over things or dodge something. So it basically describes all the characteristics of a person that any human that is not a hero has the capability to do. It is your non-heroic, but still potentially heroic characteristics. The impact also has another functionality, though. With impact, you actually have the ability to use it from that social impact standpoint within combat to de-escalate any kind of engagement. This is great if so. There are Power Outage is differentiable so that kids can be playing in their own styles at the same table while still contributing to the same story. So if you have one kid that is more comfortable with, acts of violence or whatnot, whether it be punching or physicality against a villain, you may have another kid at the table that is less comfortable with that. And they might be trying to de-escalate a situation with each character that they are involved in. They have the ability to use the de-escalate version of an impact roll, but I can get into that on a future standpoint, or I'll get later on in the video. I'll probably discuss it. So that's impact. Power is simply similar to your impact, although it is your ability to use one of your pre-existing powers. Now, kids will be able to pull, like, I'll get into how kids create powers or create their heroes, but generally, each kid will have a pool of powers that they could use a certain number of times within combat or even in any setting in Power Outage, really. And your ability to use that power effectively is determined by your power score. Power also has an impact on your more heroic characteristics. So it impacts your ability to sense things or to perceive things at a greater distance or that are very small. It's your spider sense, so to speak, your ability to know if something is going to go down. Um, so it kind of attaches to your superhuman characteristics as well as your powers, but it also relates to a heroic knowledge set. So basically, all these when the kids play these heroes, they come with somewhat of a history of heroic activities that have led up to where they start the gameplay. Because of that, they have somewhat more likely heroic knowledge that your standard, Joe Smith on the street might not know. But what this effectively does is it allows you as a GM to provide guidance to your players that, especially with kids, that they may not be able to know to look for or be familiar with. And that might decrease over time as you play things, but you basically can use the power as a hint to characters of maybe you should look in this cabinet, or maybe you notice certain specific things about the crime scene, that sort of nature. So it's your heroic knowledge set. Um, Impact and power in combat both roll against the third attribute that every character has, called Omer. So Omer is upon, Ohm, a resistance of energy. So Omer is a resistance of a power. And basically, it describes your ability to deflect either an impact attack or a power attack. And that's its primary use. It's pretty straightforward. It's your armor class, what you typically see in other tabletop RPGs. Next is yield points. Now, I use the term yield points and not hit points because there is no death in Power Outage. So, with yield points, basically, your heroes have a certain number of points that eventually, if they were to lose and get down to zero, they would basically have to be brought out of the fight until they are encouraged back into it. So they are yielding and they are encouraging rather than losing health or getting healed. And I find the terminology is important, especially if you're dealing with kids and you're dealing with situations that could potentially be, especially if we're trying to build an inclusive environment and a accessible environment. We want to make sure that kids are feeling somewhat safe at the gaming table. So you can of course play the game based off the crowd that you're playing with and refer to things as you see fit. But from a baseline standpoint, when we talk about yield points, we're referring to the point in which a person is either incapacitated or does not wish to proceed. So they may need to back off in order to regroup. At which point they could be encouraged by a teammate or they can encourage themselves to get back into the fight. So yeah, that affects robots or affects, again, your aliens or your 8-foot tall draft girls too. It doesn't. It's just a generic thing that applies to anybody that is engaged in combat. It can also be used to describe certain objects or things that you are affecting with regular force. So, for instance, there is a point in which a safe door might yield from a constant barrage of attacks, or there might be a tipping point before a stack of shelves get knocked over that has to be met through several shoves or so. So it's the point at which something yields. Both heroes have it and villains have it. So you have a set number in that brings down, and that's it. That's the four attributes. And there's only four. So it's easy to remember. It's easy to track. You can apply it to you can apply them in numerous types of ways. And the great thing about them is because there isn't a lot to keep track of, you can allow the child to keep track of their own attributes. Or if need be, it makes it easier for you as the GM to track them for the kid if they are not comfortable with tracking things, or they're not able to track things. So if a kid wants to try to slug a robotic insect, you know you might be able to more easily see their OMER or their impact score and track it for them so that you're just providing them guidance of whether it succeeds or not without necessarily demanding the calculation be done by them. So the numbers are kept simple, not only to make it easier for kids to understand, but to allow the GM to manage more information at any given table. Um, so how are these attributes impacted within a game? So there's a lot of different ways. One of which is well, let's just take combat as the baseline question. So well, actually, before we get into combat, let's talk about how do you calculate your base stats. So when you start creating a character and you're picking base stats, you're going to get to this phase eventually, but prior to getting to this phase, you're going to go through a process with, the kid playing with the GM and discussing the characters that they want to create. And based off of the character that they're creating, you'll help them to determine how they're going to create the characters and basically apply points to these attributes. So if the kid is describing a character that is overly strong physically, or maybe is more of a ranged fighter, or is overly defensive, things along that nature, then you would have a predetermined knowledge of basically where you would allow these attribute points to fall. But creating it is very simple. At the start of a character creation, every character, every hero gets 2 impact points, 2 power points, and 2 OMER points. That's their baseline stats. And they get, for yield points, they get 10 plus a d6. And a d6 is, for those, it's your standard die. It's a standard 6-sided dice. So I would roll a d6, and I would get a 4, for instance, and I would add 10 to that, and 14, and there you go. That's my starting yield points. When it comes to impact, power, and OMER, you start off with 2, and then you have 3 points. At level 1, you have 3 points, and you get to add them to any of those scores however you see fit. So I can add 2 power, and then 1 OMER, so I am now kind of more a power-based character with a little bit of defense built in. Or I might add 2 OMER and 1 impact. So now I'm less of a power-based using superhero and more of a close-in fighter, perchance, that has a solid amount of defense. or maybe I'm a striker. I go in for these quick blows, or maybe I'm a smooth talker, so I'm going to be using more of an impact. I want to bulk up on my impact, so maybe I drop 3 points directly into impact. So that's basically from a statistics standpoint. The only other thing is your travel speed, which I believe it's 4 plus 1d4, and the d4 dice looks like this little pyramid icon, a little pyramid thing right here. I don't know if I could get that right there. So you roll a d4, and then you add that to 4, and then that's your total speed. Um, but we'll get into that when we're describing the actual physical combat. So there you go. So those are the 4 attributes, and I'm trying to keep this video short so that you have an idea and that way you don't have to sit there for a very long thing. And that's how you create a character. And then in future posts and future sessions, I'll talk about the combat and how that works, and I'll talk about how these attributes play in with their powers and things of that nature. So there you go. Thank you. Take care. Have fun.